Hi everyone, welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Practice Manager Allan Krans, Senior Analyst Cassandra Mooshian, Analyst Meaghan McGrath, and Research Analyst Jackie Galway will be discussing going inside customers' minds to predict the future of cloud. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, our survey, and social sharing. To access a replay of the webinar, you can use your registration link after the webinar airs. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in ON24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Allan to begin the webinar.
Great, thanks Sarah, and thanks everybody for joining. So with today's webinar, we'll take a look at an important aspect of our coverage of the cloud market, because in a lot of ways it's simple to look at the size of the market, the growth of some of the leaders, and a lot of the buzzwords around multi-cloud, hybrid, integration, those types of things. But we're releasing a stream of research that really goes beyond just that top-level view and looks at why the market's developing the way that it is, how those numbers are actually coming to fruition in terms of the investment from customers, and also really diving into the whys, which not only illustrate what's currently happening in the market, but it's really the best way to look to the future and try to predict where things might be going and how the market is going to change going forward. So we do a lot of vendor research here at TBR, and we'll highlight the portfolio in just a minute. But this discussion draws directly from customers in terms of their feedback on why they're investing in certain solutions, how those decisions are being made, and predicting how their decision-making might change going forward. So with today's discussion, we'll start with kind of an overview of the overall changes that we see in the market that drove our most recent customer study, and some of the changes that we have in terms of the methodology for that and the types of questions that we're addressing. And then I'll have two of the lead analysts, Cassandra and Meaghan, dive into the major segments of the space, infrastructure and platforms, how those are increasingly being linked together, and are still some of the most highly invested and adopted solutions out in the market as customers leverage those capabilities to deploy their own solutions, to transition delivery models for some of their legacy software, and look to augment their own data center capacity. And then lastly, we'll look at the application space and some of the overall trends being the best-of-breed buying behavior, but still a lot of fragmentation in terms of the vendors that are providing solutions in that space, and the types of workloads that are being considered for adoption. So we'll start with just kind of a review in terms of where this discussion fits in our overall research portfolio. You see, starting on the left, a lot of the vendor coverage that we have, looking at the strategies and financial results for some of the leading providers of cloud solutions, the services around them, the components, really the whole view in terms of what customers are investing in from a cloud perspective. We also have benchmarks and market forecasts that aggregate those vendors together into the markets in which they're competing, and looks at a little bit higher level in terms of the commonalities for their strategies and the overall trends that are impacting those markets. And then, as you see highlighted, on the customer side, we're segmenting the market into applications and then infrastructure and platforms. So taking a workload view and leveraging a lot of interviews for this round of the reports, and you'll see a lot of some of the quotable material that came out of those discussions as part of that revamped research approach, but also maintaining some of that quantitative view to understand workload adoption, those types of things within the overall umbrella of applications and infrastructure. And the infrastructure one is published The applications one is publishing at the end of this week, so some of this has not actually been reported out yet. So to take a look at, for the market overall, some of the major trends, the four major things that we saw that kind of define the current state of the market. As we look at how customers are making decisions and evaluating cloud solutions, it's much more specific to the workload and the use case as the starting place for cloud adoption. So previously it was a little bit more in terms of public cloud or infrastructure or AWS overall, and looking at how that could play a role in terms of their IT environment and the decision making. Now we see a much more pragmatic approach from customers looking at the types of services that they need within their organization, and then taking that next logical step to say, what's the right delivery method solution that fits what we're trying to get from a business or a technical outcome. Secondly, to a large degree, especially in the infrastructure side, the leading vendors are pretty much solidified. When we first started looking at the cloud space, there was a lot of interest in what types of vendors are showing up. There's a lot of participants who's really competing in this space and committed to that market for the long term. A lot of those decisions have kind of been made, and the leading vendors have been identified. So you'll see a number of the kind of the market share views that really is a better way to look at the market going forward. Certainly the emerging vendors are good to cover as things change, but to a large degree the leading providers in these areas have been solidified, both from a market share view as well as from the customer perspective. I think we saw a lot of consensus in those discussions around, for certain workloads, who they were looking to and evaluating for those investments. At the same time, a lot of the, tying back to focusing on the workload first, that there's a lot more nuance in terms of the decisions that are being made there. And part of that lends to the broader availability of hybrid solutions, multi-delivery method solutions, sometimes from the same vendor. There's just a lot more available to customers, and we're seeing a lot of enhanced decision-making, taking into account the broad array of what's available from a delivery model perspective. And so there's more nuance behind some of those behavior and the decision-making process within organizations. And then lastly, I think the other thing that we're seeing from our vendor customers, but also came out during some of the interviews, that the desire to tie more of the messaging and value to how it aligns with the vendor's business, but also how that can match up and provide value within these customers, not just from a technical perspective, but from a business and an outcome perspective. So less kind of generic cost savings message is resonating in the market. Customers are really looking more to the overall value proposition for vendors that are working with, and trying to really get the most out of that for their use cases and investments. Now, in that market context, it sets up why we, so previously we had a much more survey-intensive methodology for these reports, and it was focused on public, private, cloud separately. So as we look at, as we did the research plan, we decided to shift that to focus more on the solutions themselves as the major organization point for the research, and then also adding a much more qualitative heavy approach to how we went about this. And so, it kind of hits on the first one. We realigned around workloads, seeing that customers are much more, that's the starting place for their evaluation now, much more so. Secondly, we integrated a lot of the views from our benchmarks and market forecasts to bring in that top-level perspective for how the revenue is shaping up from a market share perspective. And you'll see that throughout today's presentation. Adding in a lot more qualitative to get that nuance. And also I think there's more industry perspective that customers are looking for their cloud solutions and the specific value for their business, for their size, for their the industry that they address. And so the qualitative insight allows us to really get closer to that more nuanced story. And then lastly, addressing this kind of messaging value prop need that we saw from customers coming out and designing some of the material to specifically address the or be relevant for the sales and marketing teams at some of the buyers of this research, so that they have talking points, they have quotable material from real life customers on what the perception is for certain vendors in the market, how these solutions are being used from a workload perspective, and the value that they're looking to get out of that. So that sets up some of the kind of the background for the market overall. You know, the focus for some of the research that Cassandra and Meaghan will go through with the rest of today's call. So with that, I'll hand it over to Cassandra to talk about the infrastructure and platform space.
Great. Thanks, Allan. Switch the slide. There we go. So infrastructure as a service and platform as a service are slated to grow at a healthy, double-digit CAGRs over the next 4 years, with leading vendors like AWS and Microsoft leading that charge. Increase application usage, bring your own license agreements, and data proliferation from an uptick in analytics-based workloads have all led to some of the continually increasing demand for infrastructure capacity and past utilization. Public cloud is by far the most prominent delivery method in terms of sheer market size, as well as customer feedback almost unanimously across the board. Its simplicity in terms of self-service, on-demand provisioning really helps empower IT departments to do more on their own, and so much faster than they have been able to before. That said, there's definitely room for hosted private cloud. So that's your public cloud-like option where it's hosted in a vendor data center, but in a single tenant environment. And we do expect that market to continue to grow through 2022 as well. There are certain requirements that favor private cloud for sure, especially when you're considering the security benefits, whether real or perceived, in comparison to some public cloud environments. And there are, some companies, whether it's out of technical need or simply a corporate culture type of issue, they require that single tenant infrastructure and are willing to pay that, 20-ish% uptick in cost for that added peace of mind of not having, the fear of a breach from a neighboring VM or anything like that. And also, private cloud is a great compromise for IT departments that want to move to some cloud infrastructure for a number of reasons, whether it's reducing their IT staff, bridging some skills gaps, sharing risk with the cloud vendor, provisioning cloud backups for their data, eliminating the high cost of, an on-premise data center, including, the network and all of those various pieces. So whatever the reason may be, but they're struggling to get their higher-ups on board, whether they're risk-averse or, it's a budgetary concern or what have you. So with private cloud infrastructure as a service consumption, if that goes smoothly, then even the most kind of risk-averse or skeptical higher-ups may say, okay, this helped us in these different ways, both quantifiable and intangible benefits, business benefits. So, let's see if we can do some more of this, and what are some of the workloads that are, say, lower hanging fruit that we can, more easily migrate over to cloud. And it's also easier now than it has ever been to move one workload to cloud as a sort of test bed and still have that workload integrate and work with the broader environment. And that's because of all the work vendors have been doing in developing integrations with partner and competitor solutions and a whole bunch of new integration and multi-cloud or hybrid orchestration tools that have come and continue to come to market. So I guess what I'm saying is that we definitely expect growth in infrastructure as a service and platform as a service across the delivery methods for the foreseeable future as more and more enterprises embrace these environments.
All right. And so with that, I'm going to dive, this is Meaghan, I'm going to dive into sort of how we see vendors serving customer needs and capturing that market share over sort of the next few years that Cassandra outlined. So I think Allan set this up really well with sort of his overview of why we changed some of how our customer studies were laid out in highlighting the fact that the leading vendors have largely solidified their positions, particularly in the infrastructure and platform space. I'm pretty sure everyone on the call and even most customers are very quick to identify AWS and Microsoft Azure as the leading platform and infrastructure players. Yes, those two companies are largely public cloud heavy, much like the market is that Cassandra overviewed, but they still have some private cloud options, and they're really just dominating the space on a whole. But these vendors, they have their sort of the things they do well. They also have the things they don't do so well, and both of those really came out in a lot of the conversations that we had with customers. And so as these two vendors really fight for the market opportunity that's available, that Cassandra talked about on the previous slide, there are some sort of customer needs and adoption drivers that those vendors definitely need to keep a pulse on, because in a lot of cases, there are issues that customers have had with those two leading vendors that not only AWS and Microsoft can serve, but other trailing vendors like Google, IBM, and sort of the long tail of vendors available. Those vendors can also look at these use cases and serve those needs better and win some of the residual business. So these three themes, simplicity, predictability, and integration, are really what emerged as the keys to winning business and driving growth moving forward in the platform and infrastructure space. So I'll sort of go one by one. And starting with simplicity, it became really clear to us very quickly in our interviews that customers they're having an increasingly difficult time choosing, implementing, and managing the right services for their particular needs. In particular, a lot of customers pointed to AWS as a portfolio that you have. It's a great portfolio because they're so broad and they can serve so many different needs, but the fact that AWS is focused on continually innovating and developing new services and features really complicates their portfolio, and they're continuing to do that innovation, and which can become an issue where customers are already often confused by the overlap and the similarity of different services, so much so that the customers are really unsure of which services to use in some cases. So you can see that in the quote that we've highlighted here, that the respondent was very happy that there was a solution for pretty much anything he needed. He just needed some help figuring out which solutions to use. He knew that the answer was there, he just didn't know where it was. And so we kind of recommend that sort of use cases in particular, highlighting successful use cases across industry borders, are really going to be helpful for customers to understand what services have helped peers in like situations sort of reach their goals or address their needs. And using the partner network and sort of AWS's competency programs, I think, will really help identify which services serve certain needs, and is really what I see as sort of the only way that AWS can simplify adoption of its services, because I can be pretty sure that AWS isn't going to rebrand and reform or shrink down their portfolio at all. So just making it more consumable for the users who aren't sure which database service fits their need and for what reasons.
The other thing to add there is, I think beyond the selection of the service, we heard a pretty clear need to have things like best practice for design and configuration of those services, particularly with security vulnerabilities. There's a lot of concern amongst customers that as they go in and design and configure things, that there are best practices that they're not aware of, so that they can ensure a more secure environment and avoid some of the kind of open backdoor type issues where their data can be at risk, or they could have performance or reliability issues down the line.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that's a very valid point. And I think sort of as customers recognize sort of these issues, vendors definitely have the opportunity, and vendors in particular that are sort of trailing behind AWS. We'll speak a little bit later about sort of the feature parity, but even lagging vendors like Google Cloud, who have not created as robust a portfolio as AWS has, or even as Microsoft has, those vendors have the opportunity to really deliberately simplify their portfolios as they build them, and build these use cases from the get-go. And so really balancing that feature parity with use cases and sort of the clear branding and education tools in particular to really equip customers to use these services will be key moving forward. So once customers have sort of selected the tools they need, we move sort of onto this predictability issue. Customers have for a while been reporting sort of issues in their bills getting out of control on infrastructure, for lack of a better phrase. They're really still continuing to have issues accurately estimating the cost of their infrastructure environments, both for the initial sort of get-going cost, but also just the ongoing operations cost. This is, again, a complaint we've heard sort of time and time again from customers, and while there are sort of better cost estimation tools and some of the things that vendors have come out with that are sort of like cost calculators, there are still workloads that are becoming very complex and elevating sort of the monthly bill. I think one of the most pervasive things we heard from customers was just the understanding around sort of the cost for transferring data in and out of environments is really a distinct hindrance to moving certain systems that may have high levels of user interaction to cloud environments. So it's a catch-22 where sort of cloud is seen as sort of an enabler of sort of data-heavy systems, particularly analytics, but there are customers who are recognizing the costs associated with that, sort of the incremental data processing costs. So the quote on this slide really highlights it's a very extreme use case or a very extreme example of what can happen with costs in an environment, but we thought it spoke really well to how quickly environments that aren't managed and monitored effectively can get out of hand. So in this quote, just to sum it up, the customer started with an IoT device, and before it was even in production, they had so many employees sort of playing with the data and creating data models around it that their bill became $5 million per month before it was even in production. And so that was on Azure, and not really a fault to Azure, just a fault of sort of the customer not understanding how to properly control and manage that environment. And these sort of very extreme situations are pretty easily remedied with the vendor, but they're definitely sort of the horror stories that can turn some customers away. So I think vendors can really help thwart some of these horror stories by creating frameworks and technology recommendations and really fostering engagement with partners who have experience with sort of similar use cases to guide customers' implementations. So there's definitely a theme across sort of the simplicity and predictability recommendations where leveraging partners and use cases to really help customers best use the correct services is really key. And so I think one other sort of suggestion for the predictability side would be for vendors to establish more rigid sort of guardrail options for customers that go sort of beyond the traditional administration tools. Azure has a spending limit feature that they put on sort of trials and credits. That's an interesting concept, but to really have an impact on customers such as these, I think implementing that on a production scale would be an easy way for vendors to really improve the predictability of environments by putting a cap on usage. And so moving on just to the integration piece, I think this one is a little more straightforward. Customers are definitely expecting vendors to support the latest software versions at all levels of the technology stack, despite the difficulty this may pose for vendors. We're really seeing this as this quote sort of lays out, the firmware versions. This is becoming a much bigger issue as customers integrate sort of multiple cloud environments. So where customers are trying to run sort of AWS services next to Microsoft services, where AWS has, according to the customers we talk to, been very sort of timely about their software updates. Vendors like Azure are not keeping pace with that, and that's creating a big hindrance to these sort of hybrid cloud or multi-cloud environments, so much so that the customer quoted here has actually noted that they're dropping out of some of their Azure usage because of the lack of interoperability. So definitely, I think there's a pretty straightforward remedy to speeding up the software update cycles, but it's definitely a threat that vendors, especially vendors being adopted into sort of that second role alongside AWS, that the vendors across the board really need to be aware of. All right. And so this kind of speaks to that last point I made, that overall infrastructure and platform environments, they're already multi-vendor with sort of, in most cases, an AWS instance and then sort of an Azure or an IBM or a Google instance alongside that. But there's still more than a third of our respondents that expect to increase the number of vendors they're using over the next 2 years. And so that really, to me, speaks to the opportunity available to sort of the long tail of vendors outside of the established leading vendors. So as long as the vendors can effectively serve those key themes we talked about, the simplicity, predictability, and integration for customers, they'll be positioned well to capture some of the market growth that Cassandra mentioned over the next couple of years. And so you can see from the graph in the lower right-hand corner, AWS will, in our opinion, continue to grow as they've been growing. They'll sustain market share, but some of the smaller vendors that are going to serve that sort of second vendor position, like Azure and Google and IBM and even Alibaba, who's sort of a dark horse on the international front, those vendors will definitely come in and take some of the market growth opportunity. And so, I mean, I think just as an anecdotal or a quantitative example of that, while AWS's market share will stay the largest and grow very minimally, we expect Microsoft Azure's market share to nearly double over the next 5 years. So definitely some impressive growth to be shared across the market. All right. And so now we're just going to dive into some of the vendor-specific customer perception stuff we got out of the surveys. I think we've spoken a little anecdotally to some of this, but overall, again, AWS being the clear market leader, customers really see AWS as having the most robust portfolio And as I mentioned, to the point of almost having too many services that hinder that idea of simplicity. But customers really do appreciate the really robust functionality that they can find across AWS's portfolio. And when AWS is monitored and managed effectively, customers continue to see AWS as sort of the low-cost infrastructure provider that really helps AWS win where there is sort of a total cost of ownership discussion, especially in sort of enterprise-wide cloud considerations. Having sort of the balance of very robust functionality while still being price or cost competitive is really a really strong position for AWS to hold. And that's something they've done even without sort of the really rapid price reductions that they were once known for. They're still managing to deliver customers sort of low prices as they scale really rapidly. And beyond that sort of functionality and price piece, customers are even noting that AWS is still exceeding their expectations, and that's particularly in the ease of use of data integration or data integration tools and really the overall user experience. So with all these pieces in place to really perpetuate AWS's mindshare, other vendors are left to compete amongst themselves for those residual opportunities. I think, so for Azure, we've really already mentioned that they're sort of the next closest number two. I kind of look at the market in three camps of the vendors that we've talked about so far. There's AWS, there's Microsoft, and then there's sort of Google, IBM, Alibaba as the ones that really get to compete amongst themselves. But Microsoft has, over the last 2 years, really set itself apart from sort of that long tail of vendors. They've solidified themselves as a strong second place with pretty close feature parity to AWS and really beating out sort of Google and IBM on the breadth of their portfolio. I think another thing that has really helped Microsoft, though we don't mention it too much in this section, is their Office 365 portfolio. It's created a lot of cross-selling opportunities that have really differentiated Microsoft from anyone else in the market. So one downfall that customers did note about Microsoft was that while they've come really far over the last couple of years, in particular, one of those things they've done is made a lot of strides in the open source arena, but they're really not there yet on the open source front. They've made commitments, they've made some progress, but customers are still looking for more. So that's something we'll watch for Azure to overcome in the next couple of years. But in the meantime, Microsoft has really effectively executed on its efforts to master innovative areas like machine learning and IoT, and is being considered a really strong option by customers for those use cases. Ultimately, sort of these sorts of workloads will drive really high value for both the customers and Microsoft as they process sort of new large data sets. But this will really butt up against the need for that cost predictability that Microsoft will need to help manage among customers. So they aren't getting those sort of pre-production IoT workloads generating $5 million per month bills. So definitely something to keep track of as customers put all this data in the cloud and start really implementing IoT workloads. And the last vendor I'll cover is Google, and then I'll pass it off to Cassandra. Google, its customer perception, as I'm sure Cassandra will sort of mention also with IBM, customers are singing a very different tune for Google than they are for AWS and Microsoft. There was a lot of praise around AWS and Microsoft across customers, a lot of sort of there are one and two discussions. But Google was really seen as sort of the vendor that customers they're trying so hard to consider them, but at the end of the day, it didn't pan out. And I think that really speaks to what Google's trying to do. Google's been talking a lot about an enterprise strategy and trying to really be an enterprise-grade cloud provider. Rebranded a lot of go-to-market strategy, or they reformed a lot of their go-to-market strategies. But sadly, customers, they're hearing these attempts for Google to reform itself, but they're really not seeing the execution yet. So it's really a discussion of sort of the business savvy higher ups in Google that have been hired into the company are talking the talk, but the field sales and product engineers interfacing with the enterprises still aren't able to really walk the walk, as customers kind of put it. There definitely are bright spots for Google. TensorFlow was a huge talking point for customers. Customers really love TensorFlow. They consider it sort of what Google can use as their differentiator. But Google's taking TensorFlow into sort of the open source space and taking a very similar approach that they did to Android, where it will be a very successful and highly adopted product or service, but the route that they're taking is going to take a while. So overall, the execution just really isn't there yet, and that's deeply hurting Google as it competes for the infrastructure and PaaS workloads against AWS and Microsoft.
All right. And for IBM, something Meaghan just said about AWS really, kind of rang true for IBM as well. One of their advantages and disadvantages is the fact that there's just so much going on portfolio-wise that it's hard to grasp it all. Some of the feedback that we got from customers when talking to them, kind of centered around, we didn't know that they did X, Y, and Z, or IBM is, all IBM all the time. They're not going to support our Amazon or Azure environments, what have you, or, I think of IBM and I think of mainframe. So some of IBM's probably biggest hurdles are some perception challenges, unfortunately. And then, the other big challenge for IBM is really kind of the company tripping over its own feet at times. For lack of a better phrase, there's overlapping, solutions across business units. There are separate or adjacent business unit agendas and revenue targets, and that kind of complicates its go-to-market strategy and messaging at times. And I think the most notable struggle for IBM in terms of cloud is when you look at their public versus their private cloud messaging. On one hand, you see all these data center footprint expansions, the architecture within the data centers continually being upgraded, and a definite focus on public cloud in terms of messaging those data center upgrades and capabilities, when really IBM's dedicated, which is what we call hosted private cloud, and their bare metal infrastructure both also come from those data centers. And that's really where IBM, in my opinion, is much strongest, and that's where we see them kind of rise and shine up through the ranks. IBM's definitely the market leader in hosted private cloud. So I think, kind of just sticking to its core there and really focusing on that dedicated yet hosted infrastructure as a service is really going to be the bright spot for them going forward. And, IBM has all of the pieces in place to be successful in cloud. But linking them together and kind of clarifying the messaging is going to be probably the most critical thing for them going forward. IBM is undoubtedly a rooted technology vendor and one of the few vendors left that has cloud capabilities that span customer data centers as well as its own data centers, and is, I think, more than capable in both areas. It's just a matter of, maybe not trying to be the best of the best in either area and focusing really on that core competency of being able to do both really well, and helping those large enterprise customers kind of bridge those gaps. And unfortunately for IBM, too, speaking of those large enterprise customers, much of its speed and its success in the cloud market is resting on its notoriously risk-averse and slow-moving, really large enterprise customer base. compared to, the other vendors that Meaghan just talked about. So it's kind of a slightly different approach and a different timetable for IBM. And I definitely think that there are challenges for IBM to overcome, as is true with any vendor. But I also think that there are definite, pockets of growth and positive outlook. So with that, we're going to move on to the application side of things and look at some of the feedback around SaaS applications and vendors. And I'm going to hand it back over to Meaghan.
All right. Thank you. So this is a little bit simpler graphic, but gives a lot of the same information as the infrastructure and platform graphic that Cassandra spoke to earlier in the deck. This is our market projections of the SaaS market across both public multi-tenant SaaS and hosted private sort of single-tenant SaaS. Where customers are really more astute about whether their platform and infrastructure workloads are private or public, as Cassandra mentioned, there's a lot of sort of consideration about the pros and cons, about the cost and the security and the control over the environment in the platform and infrastructure space. There's less of that shows through in sort of the final decision about public versus private SaaS. But what we really found was that there was a balance of customers. There were the customers that said, as the quote on the screen describes, sort of the delivery method doesn't matter, I just want the functionality at the end of the day. But sort of the counter to that was there were also a lot of customers that sort of noted a lot of the same concerns and issues about the environment as the infrastructure and platform customers talked about. There were customers that noted that going into a public cloud SaaS environment was not very flexible, wasn't very transparent. They lost a lot of control. It was costly. But I think personally one of the real sort of differences is in the infrastructure and platform space, there's a lot of transparency across vendor offerings that enables customers to make those decisions. Whereas in the SaaS market, you don't hear as much about sort of the multi-tenant versus the single-tenant option. It's just the cloud option. And so customers are really making the consideration. It's less about public versus private SaaS and more about, do I keep what I have on-prem or do I put it in the cloud? And the cloud is really synonymous for the multi-tenant SaaS environments. So there's a lot of customers that we talk to that are really having sort of that internal conflict about whether to keep things on-prem or put them, or to adopt sort of a full-blown SaaS solution. Really one of the biggest hindrances that we heard for cloud application adoption was the cost. Many customers were really happy to have the management and automated patches, but they had a really difficult time justifying the much higher recurring cost of subscriptions over sort of the one-time on-premise software license that they could then amortize over 10 or more years. We heard a lot about this on sort of the Office suite front. There were plenty of customers who had gone to Office 365 and were sort of lamenting that they missed paying, what was it, $161 for a license and amortizing it over 10 years or something along those lines. So there's definitely a lot of consideration about the cost. Customers understand that they're getting a lot more functionality, but I think as one respondent really summed it up well, they noted that their company was not only spending anywhere from 10 to 11 times more on their cloud-based HR system than they were when it was on-prem, but they additionally had to add an extra role in their company to run reports because the cloud solution now had more excessive sort of bells and whistles, and that not only has the cost gone up both on the price of the product and the manpower to really take advantage of everything, but they've really lost control of the environment. where they couldn't turn the system off when they recognized an issue because the infrastructure stack was multi-tenant. And they really had to wait for the vendor to resolve issues and were really at the mercy of the diagnostics that the vendor had put in place. This customer noted that there was a breach, and at the end of the day, even after it was fixed, the vendor couldn't tell the customer why that breach had happened. And so where customers are already really paying notably more for these cloud-based systems, vendors really need to help customers reduce their internal costs to compensate for those higher price tags. I think one thing that customers really said was that they weren't reducing their internal headcount for a multitude of reasons, but that's something to really consider as vendors are making sort of this value prop for cloud applications. That and really bringing the management standards up to customer expectations. Obviously, the customers can't have control in a multi-tenant environment, but helping them with a little bit of transparency, I think customers said would definitely make a big impact for them. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cassandra to dive a little deeper on what customers were saying.
Perfect, thank you. So we've talked a lot about cloud and, the different, SaaS infrastructure as a service, but kind of want to switch gears a little bit and talk about professional services, and this is specific to professional services around applications. So, the automated kind of self-service nature of cloud as a service workloads across the stack kind of fundamentally disrupts the professional services market. Those 10-year, very expensive, long-term outsourcing engagements are, for the most part, gone, and instead, services engagements are shorter, 1 to 3 or 3 to 5 year, in length, and they're more one-off or pointed at a specific pain point in particular. One of the most common use cases that we've seen from, talking to these customers and end users for cloud professional services adoption in relation to SaaS, aside from consulting and education in regards to, what vendors to use, what solutions are out there, et cetera, is really that app configuration. A lot of what we heard from the interviews was that off-the-shelf SaaS applications get you about 80% of the way there, meaning they're generally sufficient for line of business needs and meet pretty much most day-to-day requirements, and often even then some. But once application utilization becomes really mature across an organization and users are to the point where they want to utilize the data for bigger and better things, that's when they kind of look to an SI to help with configurations and customizations and get them the rest of the way there. Prior to the past, 12, 18 months, one of the more common use cases was around integration, or application integration, But the applications themselves have become so much more robust and feature more integrations and connections that IT departments are now better equipped to take this task back in-house. And that's not to say that the opportunity has gone away for app-related SI work. There's always going to be a need for SIs, especially as, environments become more and more hybridized and more organizations look to bring your own license scenarios. It's just that the role is changing. And one interview that we recently did that was especially interesting, and the quote on the left of the slide is actually one small piece of a much larger quote from this gentleman. We were talking to an IT director at a large pharmaceutical company, and he was telling us that when you're an IT lead at such a large corporation, management tends to be more risk averse, especially when it comes to hosting any application that is customer facing whatsoever. So it was pretty interesting to hear him say things like, there are times where we can do these things ourselves, or we can do it cheaper with a smaller vendor, but management really likes knowing that the top guys are involved. And that's when he was talking about the management consultants and Accenture and what have you. He had quite a bit to say as well about how does just as much of an industry culture in terms of how you're adopting cloud solutions and who from, as it is an organizational culture. He said, you know, in such a regulated industry like pharmaceuticals, you kind of wait for your biggest competitor to do something first and see how it goes, and before you jump into it. So that could be, you know, SaaS adoption, you know, are they utilizing a third party to help them or not, that kind of thing. And another overarching reason we heard from our conversations in regards to cloud professional services usage is because cloud automation essentially forced some companies to shrink their IT staffs. But then they all of a sudden realized that there were these skills gaps that bubbled to the surface upon, you know, ad hoc workload adoption, and realized, oh shoot, we can't get that done ourselves. We need to, you know, look to an SI to help us, you know, get this up and running. There are definitely plus sides to utilizing systems integrators in terms of cloud adoption, but some of the people that we talked to honestly expressed reasons why they're more often steering away from utilizing SIs now. A couple of those main reasons were, one guy said, no, I don't want to use an outside party anymore because my IT department essentially steps back and washes their hands of it, and they don't learn anything. So it's, you know, it reminds you of that phrase, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. And this IT director got frustrated, and he wanted his team to at least learn something from the process. The other reason was, you know, it depends on the type of software that you're looking to implement. If it's a niche software, SIs might be too generalized, and so you go with that niche software vendor instead. But if it's broader, like an SAP HANA integration or what have you, an SI usually suffices. So with that, we're going to move on to the next slide, and I know we're running low on time, so I'm pretty much going to skip over this one. But the premise here is that Meaghan already touched on it earlier. You know, delivery method is less important than, you know, the idea of moving to cloud and the benefits that cloud can bring to an organization. And then really what I just wanted to quickly highlight is that bottom graph and that dotted line, you know, showing that over the next couple of years, there's going to be so many more applications vendors utilized. That's, you know, as workload features, functionalities improve and in all of the different SaaS markets. Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah, and I think just one small point there is I think as we're going to talk about when we bring up some of the vendors on the next slide, that a lot of that growth in application vendor usage is really due to sort of the usage of best-of-breed vendors.
Yep.
So you're going to bring in multiple best-of-breed vendors rather than go with sort of larger multi-function suites.
All right, so with Salesforce, Salesforce has really defined the cloud-based CRM marketplace. When speaking with one customer, they refer to Salesforce as the Cadillac provider for front office solutions. And this has come at a high price that most customers are willing to pay for, but that's not to say some decision makers that we've spoken with have been deliberate in their search for a front office provider and are willing to sacrifice functionality for a lower cost provider. And Salesforce has been able to expand in the front office because of its CRM dominance. And most recently, it moved into e-commerce, where roughly 90% of respondents we spoke to said they were willing to move to a cloud-based e-commerce solution. And that was actually the highest, the solution that everyone was most likely to migrate to. Moreover, CRM gives them an opportunity to, when a company adopts an e-commerce solution from Salesforce, they are able to also take, that creates a cross-selling opportunity for Salesforce. Customers find Salesforce is easier to use than competitive offerings from Microsoft and Oracle because Salesforce's business applications are designed to be more consumable, which is something that Salesforce has been focused on since its inception. However, while it's easy to implement and use these solutions, integration at the database and platform platform layer is still difficult for customers. This goes back to when Salesforce acquired ExactTarget to create its marketing cloud. Its platform, Fuel, has never fully integrated with the Salesforce platform, creating an additional integration hurdle for customers. But Salesforce has been improving integration at the database layer, most recently seen with the Service Cloud and Commerce Cloud integrations, and will leverage MuleSoft's technology to further improve internal integrations.
Mm-hmm.
So because Salesforce is a user-friendly and easy-to-implement provider, it's been brought into organizations through more of a shadow IT model. While this gets Salesforce into the organization, it isn't integrating with the company's IT environment, so users are unable to extract the full value of Salesforce's solutions. And as a result, these organizations see the need to adopt a company-wide system. In many of these cases, Salesforce will be the front runner because of its existing presence in the organization. And among the respondents that we spoke to, they decided to leverage Salesforce company-wide. Salesforce worked with them to remove the existing Salesforce environment and replace it with a fully integrated solution that spans the organization and allows them to leverage the full breadth of the solution.
Yeah, and so I think two other vendors that are definitely sort of considered in the application space are the I'm going to kind of talk to SAP and Oracle together because they're being looked at very similarly, which is quite a funny thing to say considering their backgrounds. SAP being obviously very strong in the legacy ERP space, but Oracle really coming in from the database side of things historically. Right now, what we're hearing from customers on the SaaS side is that Oracle and SAP are really only being considered in the conversation. Not only, but a lot of customers are saying that they're being considered because of their legacy presence. It's not because of the solutions necessarily being top of mind. It's because of sort of that old guard that's still within these organizations, recommending that the company at least consider SAP and Oracle applications for the company's new SaaS needs. SAP and Oracle definitely have sort of a leg up over Salesforce and Workday and some of the other niche providers. When you look at this same kind of thought logic in the old guard of sort of staying with your vendor, that's definitely serving SAP and Oracle in the sense that those same customers are looking for suites of applications. Those are not the customers that are going in and looking for sort of a best-of-breed one-off cloud provider. They're looking for that integrated suite that also still works with the legacy technology so that you can create a really deeply integrated application front end, even if it's sort of in the cloud, but still integrate that backwards into sort of your legacy system and create a really true hybrid IT scenario, and that's really where SAP and Oracle are seeing success. They definitely have some cloud-native acquisitions that are dragging in some business, but sort of similar to Salesforce, some of the hurdles that Salesforce is facing, customers definitely noted some integration issues, and that's really sort of hindering some of this cloud-first perception for customers.
And with Workday, it has really leveraged reference customers to help convey Workday's value to potential customers, which we have seen in recent quarters, typically or specifically in the education market. And based on our respondents, we've also seen that new hires can help bring Workday into an organization kind of in a Trojan horse type of fashion. For example, a professional services firm hired an IT leader that had a positive experience implementing Workday at his previous organization. So when he came into his new organization and mentioned the positive experience he had, it was a large part of the deciding factor into bringing in Workday. And lower brand awareness than SAP and Oracle internationally has typically been because of Workday's smaller geographic presence, but a lot of adoption has been happening in the U.S., whereas internationally markets have been slower to adopt cloud delivery as well. Decision makers generally find that cloud is not secure enough for sensitive HR and financial information as well. In TBR's customer study, more than half of respondents said that they will never move their HR systems to the cloud. And as an HR and financial management provider, this is a constant hurdle that Workday has faced as it attempts to push into larger financial institutions. We've seen that in financial services, one man said that he would consider a public cloud financial solution, but only if other large financial institutions adopted it first. And that is kind of a cyclical issue. And to overcome this, Workday will leverage reference customers to expand in both HR and financial management services. And with that, that concludes our prepared remarks, and we will open it for questions.
Yeah, so we have one question, and then we'll answer the rest that come offline, because I know that we are over time. So the question was around how we saw hybrid show up in terms of the customer perception and where that fits in terms of these overall market trends. And so I think when we, again, when we look at the buzzwords, it's certainly one that continues to be out there. I think when we spoke with customers, it was really more of a low-key type approach where they expect the integration. They're not making a big production about being a hybrid adopter or the fact that they were able to put that functionality in place. So I think on the ground with customers, they're looking for the benefits of hybrid. They're achieving them either through some of the API integrations that are available, leveraging some of the integration work from third-party firms, but it doesn't always show up as a hybrid cloud or a hybrid IT type label as they think about what's going on inside their own organization. Okay. All right, so that ends today's webinar. Please continue to submit questions either in the portal or they can be taken via email afterwards to Sarah, and she'll get those to us, and we'll make sure that we get back to you. All right, everybody, thanks for joining.